designation. As an archaeologist, I find the title of this webinar to be inspirational. I know all too well that archaeological excavation can be destructive to the material record that tells us who we as humans are and what our relationship with the environment has been. And archaeology can be as destructive to relationships among humans when it is a form of arrogance. An invasion of sacred homelands conducted with disregard for the physical remains of the ancestors of those who were displaced. Now, today, there are thankfully non-destructive technologies available that allow us to discover the previously unrecognized complexity and enormous regional scope of the cultures that were displaced by Europeans. Europeans who arrived many thousands of years after these cultures had been well established by Native Americans. Now you will hear about how these non-invasive technologies have been used to exponentially expand our appreciation of Hopewell culture by means of an international partnership with colleagues from our German Archaeological Institute. And most importantly, you will hear about efforts to reconnect the astounding, and as we know now, vast Hopewell landscape with those who created it and were forcibly removed from it in the 19th century. Let this be seen as an example of healing our country's cultural fractures inflicted in the past, but that have persisted for far too long. With that, it is my great pleasure now to introduce Jennifer Altman, Director of Historic Sites and Museums and World Heritage Project Director, Ohio History Connection, who will moderate this webinar. Thank you all for watching.
Thank you so much, Doug. On behalf of Ohio History Connection, our partners at the National Park Service's Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, and our World Heritage Ohio Ambassadors Committee, we want to thank you and US ECOMOS for inviting us to present this webinar. You have been and continue to be a wonderful partner in our effort, and we're honored to share a piece of our journey today. In 2008, when the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks was added to the US's tentative list for World Heritage, I think it was hard for anyone to imagine the path in front of us. Over the past dozen years, my colleagues have worked diligently to do the very best by this nomination, asking not only what must be done to achieve World Heritage inscription, but also asking what should be done to properly honor these 8 remarkable American Indian earthworks. Today, you'll hear about some of this work, including advancing research and interpretation in new directions, and most importantly, growing deep and trusting relationships with the tribal nations that have historic ties to Ohio. This work has started, but it will never end. The prospect of World Heritage has been a catalyst to do our very best. So once again, thank you for inviting us to present today. And I would like to open by sharing a few words from Ohio Senators Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown, who we thank for their unwavering support of our work.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Rob Portman. I'm really pleased to voice my support for the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks to be recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Thanks to Todd Kleismet and the Ohio History Connection for asking me to join in advocating for this important decision. The Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks, massive mounds and enclosures shaped into geometric forms, represent some of the last remnants of the Ohio Hopewell culture that existed across much of the Ohio River Valley during the Middle Woodland period. Some individual mounds stretch more than 1,000 feet across, and this nomination consists of a total of 8 earthworks within 3 site locations. I've had the opportunity to visit the Hopewell Mounds many times, and I always come away impressed by the way they have endured as a distinctive symbol of the vibrant indigenous people and cultures who existed in Ohio thousands of years ago. I believe these earthworks deserve to be recognized globally for showcasing a mastery of landscape architecture that took place in Ohio nearly 2 millennia ago. Thanks to the National Committee for the International Council on Monuments and Sites for their consideration of this important Ohio national, and I would say global landmark.
Well, we really appreciate the support of our elected leaders. They've just have been wonderful as we've worked on this World Heritage nomination.
I'm Sherrod Brown. It's an honor to serve Ohio and the nation and the United States Senate. Thanks to the Ohio History Connection for inviting me to speak in support of adding Ohio's Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks to UNESCO's World Heritage List. People have thrived in the Ohio River Valley. We know for thousands of years, few will make the lasting impression left by the Hopewell people. The mounds, the earthworks they built around Chillicothe and Heath and Newark and in Oregon, you're a unique example of North American mound building. These sites are masterpieces of human creativity and ingenuity that have recorded the achievements of their creators for generations. Ohioans recognize the great responsibility of maintaining these treasures for future generations. As some of Ohio's oldest landmarks, both Ohio Senator Portman and I believe they're worthy to be the state's first sites to be added to the World Heritage List. I've been proud to work with the Ohio History Connection for years, with World Heritage Ohio, with their partners to help advance the nomination of these earthworks. Thank you for the work you do across the globe to recognize and document so many natural, cultural, and historical sites.
Well, and now I'd like to transition. At the Ohio History Connection, World Heritage is incredibly important to us. And I would like to share comments from Bert Logan, our Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer, about the World Heritage effort.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bert Logan, Executive Director and CEO of the Ohio History Connection. On behalf of our Board of Trustees, our staff, and our many volunteer stakeholders and partners who are deeply invested in the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks World Heritage nomination, I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar. I wish I could be here in person, but a previously planned trip to reconnect with family in sunny Florida won out. The Ohio History Connection was established as a private organization in 1885 at the urging of state leaders to stem the exploitation of the remains of ancient American Indians and funerary and sacred items taken from burial mounds by museums throughout the United States and even in Europe. Our solution to the issue was to continue the excavation of burial mounds, but to keep the exhumed individuals and their related belongings in our possession, where they largely still remain. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we also received title to several ancient American Indian sacred sites, two of which, the Newark Earthworks and Fort Ancient, will be referenced in this webinar, along with the Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. Organizations and political bodies implement decisions that are made by human beings, acting as individuals and as a collective. And because all humans are fallible and imperfect, it follows that organizations and political bodies are likewise fallible and imperfect. It is painfully obvious that American Indians as individuals, as tribes, and as a people have been severely and shamefully mistreated and marginalized since the arrival of Europeans on the North American continent. Regrettably, the Ohio History Connection's hands in this matter are not clean. From 1885 until relatively recently, the Ohio History Connection felt and acted as if it owned these unearthed individuals, their burial possessions, and their sacred sites, and that as an organization, we were solely responsible for their fate, which is another way of saying the organization continually turned a deaf ear to repeated entries by historic Ohio tribal nations, all of whom were forcibly removed from the state by the 1840s. Today, the Ohio History Connection realizes how misguided our treatment of American Indians, their ancestors, and their legacies since 1885 has been. We now realize that while we are legally responsible for the sites, the disinterred ancient American Indians and their burial items in our care, we do not own them. Instead, we are their stewards, with the solemn responsibility to work in unison with the historic Ohio tribes to simply do the right thing. We cannot undo our injustices of the last 130 years. However, I can proudly, yet humbly, say we are diligently working to address and correct our mistakes. We have instituted a moratorium on the destructive testing of human remains without the consent of the affiliated tribe or tribes, established a permanent director of American Indian Relations staff position, collaborated with the Delaware Tribe of Indians to rebury 84 ancestors at one of our historic sites, hosted an annual Tribal Nations Conference since 2016 with an invitation to all 45 historic Ohio tribes, amended our governing documents to allow an enrolled member of an historic Ohio tribal nation who may not reside within the state to serve on our Board of Trustees, adopted the organization's first American Indian policy to govern both our interactions with contemporary American Indians and the treatment of ancient American Indians, their possessions, and their sites entrusted to our care. Begun planning for the establishment of a cemetery at one of our historic sites that will be available for reburial of repatriated ancestors. Taken legal action through eminent domain to acquire from the Mound Builders Country Club its lease of the Newark Octagon Earthworks in order to make the site fully accessible to the public. And most recently, we hired our first Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act specialist to work with the historic Ohio tribes for the repatriation of ancestors in our care. I share these small steps not to be self-congratulatory, but to illustrate two broader commitments. The first is a commitment that has emerged from the World Heritage inscription process. The Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks were placed on the National Park Service's tentative list in 2008, at a time when our organization had not yet welcomed the historic Ohio tribal nations. Even if it could have been possible to comply in letter with the Indigenous stakeholder participation and endorsement spelled out in the inscription process, it would have been inauthentic, transactional, and flat. Instead, the inscription process has been a catalyst for us to embrace Indigenous stakeholder participation in letter and in spirit, which has been truly transformational for our organization in so many areas beyond seeking World Heritage inscription. The second commitment emanated from another of today's presenters, Chief Glenna Wallace, leader of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. For many years, Chief Glenna has been an inspiring example of what it means to do the right thing. Her calm yet persistent, and when necessary, assertive manner and leadership has been a steady beacon to me personally, to the Ohio History Connection, and to this World Heritage inscription process. She is a dear friend and colleague, and I do not exaggerate when I say we most likely would not be assembled this afternoon were it not for Chief Glenna's commitment. So thank you, Chief Glenna, for helping us understand and take to heart what it means to do the right thing. I thank each of you for joining us today, and we all look forward to the day when we can celebrate the World Heritage inscription of the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks.
I want to thank Bert for those thoughtful comments. While he couldn't be with us in person today, I know how important World Heritage is to him, and I especially appreciate his comments about collaboration with Chief Glenna Wallace, whose leadership positively impacts our work every day, and we'll get to hear from her in just a little bit. But first, it's my pleasure to introduce Brett Ruby, archaeologist at Hopewell National Historical Park, to share an overview of the nomination and his exciting and innovative research. Brett?
Good, thank you. I'm going to share some slides with you. So thank you for this opportunity. And I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking here today from Chillicothe, Ohio, in the traditional homelands of the absentee Shawnee, the Eastern Shawnee, and the Shawnee tribes, and other tribes of the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley region. Nearly 2,000 years ago, here in the Ohio Valley, American Indians built the most spectacular concentration of monumental mounds and earthen enclosures to be found anywhere in the world. These earthwork complexes were ceremonial landscapes used for feasts and funerals, dances, and prayers associated with an American Indian religious movement that swept over half the continent for almost 400 years. The earthworks are unique and exceptional among ancient monuments worldwide in their enormous scale, geometric precision, and intricate astronomical alignments. Associated ritual deposits contain finely crafted objects fashioned from exotic raw materials obtained from distant parts of North America. And surprisingly, these gigantic sacred places were built and used by societies without hereditary leadership or intensive agriculture. Our World Heritage nomination is a serial nomination, including 8 component earthworks, 5 managed by the National Park Service and 3 managed by the Ohio History Connection. Our nomination effort is supported by a broad and deep coalition of American Indian tribes, community leaders, business and tourism interests, and grassroots ambassadors organized under the banner of World Heritage Ohio. The 8 earthworks in our nomination are scattered all across Southern Ohio. The Ohio History Connection sites include the Newark Earthworks east of Columbus and the Fort Ancient Earthworks in the southwest near Dayton. The National Park Service sites include a cluster of 5 earthworks surrounding Chillicothe in south central Ohio. These 5 are units of Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. The nomination includes the finest examples of the 2 major classes of Hopewell earthworks. First, the geometric earthworks, composed of intricate and elegant combinations of circles, squares, octagons, and long parallels or avenues. These represent miles and miles of earthen walls, anywhere from 3 to 20 feet tall, carefully sculpted into regular and repeated forms. And the second class includes the hilltop enclosures, which follow the natural topography to enclose prominent hilltops. Fort Ancient is the finest example, with 3.5 miles of massive earthen walls enclosing more than 100 acres. It incorporates dozens of carefully constructed ponds or water features into its architectural landscape design. To be inscribed on the World Heritage List, a site must meet at least one of 10 selection criteria. And the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks meet at least 2. First, these are masterpieces of human creative genius. And second, these earthworks bear unique or exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition or a civilization which is living or has disappeared. And now I'll give just a few examples of how the earthworks in our nomination express these World Heritage criteria. One example of human creative genius is the amazingly complex way that many of these earthworks are astronomically aligned to the cyclical movements of the sun and moon along the horizon. Probably the best example is the Newark Octagon. The walls, gateways, and long axis of this elegant figure are carefully placed to point to 8 significant places where the moon rises or sets over a long cycle that repeats only every 18.6 years. The view you see here on the right is one that can only be observed once in a generation. Every 18.6 years, the moon rises at its northernmost point on the horizon, and the long axis of the earthwork from the circle through the octagon is precisely aligned to this point. And here's another example from the Newark Earthworks showing the astounding indigenous knowledge of geometry that is built into the earthworks. The Newark Complex sprawls over 4 square miles with circles, squares, octagons, and avenues. And the figures are related to one another in complex ways. This circle encloses an area of 20 acres. This is exactly equal to the area enclosed in this square. And the perimeter of this square is exactly equal to the circumference of this circle. And on the right-hand side, you can see a significant dimension, a standard unit of measure equal to 1,054 feet. This dimension is repeated again and again in different earthworks here at Newark, and also occurs in several earthworks built more than 60 miles away at Chillicothe. This next slide focuses on some of the exquisite works of art that were used at the earthworks, exchanged as gifts, and ultimately deposited there. These are just a few of hundreds of objects that, taken together, represent one of the world's great art styles. These represent a distinctive and recognizable cultural tradition that was shared not just across Southern Ohio, but across all of Eastern North America. This slide shows 3 examples of the instantly recognizable Hopewell zoned ceramic tradition. These vessels with abstract and highly stylized bird imagery were deposited at far-flung locations in Ohio, Illinois, and even as far away as the lower Mississippi Valley in Louisiana. And finally, this slide shows just how far and wide Hopewell traditions extended. Beautiful raw materials were gathered to Ohio from across half the continent. Copper and silver from the Great Lakes, shark teeth from the Chesapeake Bay, mica from the Blue Ridge Mountains, marine shells from the Gulf, quartz and galena from the Ozarks, grizzly bear teeth from the Rockies, Knife River flint from the Dakotas, and the most exotic of all exotics, obsidian from the geyser basins of Yellowstone National Park. All these materials flowed in great quantities into the great Hopewell centers in Ohio. And it seems this flow was not really driven by trade. Instead, it seems these extraordinary items were carried by pilgrims into Ohio as gifts or offerings, or collected and brought back home by Ohioans who ventured out on quests to meet with powerful people and places. And this is the power of these earthworks and of our World Heritage nomination. These earthworks connect people, the earth, and the cosmos across space and time. And so with that introduction, I'm going to switch gears a bit and talk about how our World Heritage nomination is driving tribal reconnection and archaeological discovery. So let me switch here. So first, I'd like to talk about a couple of ways that recent advances in archaeological research are changing our understanding of these remarkable places. I'll talk about how these new understandings are changing the ways we manage and protect these sites, and also how these new understandings are changing the stories we tell and how we tell these stories. And second, I'd like to talk a bit about how designating these sites under the World Heritage Convention will provide a new framework for engagement with tribal nations in future research, management, and storytelling at these sites. This framework gives tribal nations a more active role in using archaeological research as a tool to recover and restore stories and histories that were lost or stolen under colonization. So one of the benefits of our World Heritage effort is that it's already beginning to attract international interest. About 5 years ago, I happened to meet a team from the German Archaeological Institute at a conference. I told them a bit about these amazing American Indian earthworks and our World Heritage effort, and they were inspired to bring their one-of-a-kind experimental magnetometer rig to Ohio. This vehicle-towed system is 4 meters wide with 16 sensors spaced at quarter-meter intervals, and it collects measurements every 20 millimeters along each transect, moving at about 6 miles an hour. It's all this data is referenced in real time to GPS, and it's capable of scanning more than 25 acres a day. Over 3 seasons, we've surveyed almost 2 square miles, the largest magnetic data set ever collected in North America. And as Doug Comer pointed out in his introduction, this is a non-invasive technology that lets us see beneath the surface of the ground without disturbance. And when more invasive excavation is necessary to identify the source of a magnetic disturbance or to collect charcoal for radiocarbon dating, for example, we can use a much more targeted surgical approach and reduce the risk of disturbing sensitive areas. So this next slide shows the results of almost 300 acres of magnetic surveys surrounding the Great Circle and Square earthwork complex at the Hopewell Works near Chillicothe. The magnetic signature of the earthworks is highlighted here in green. And this next slide shows one of the most important results of this work. The earthworks have unfortunately been damaged by plowing, and they're very difficult to see from the ground level. But now we can use the magnetic map as a guide to accurately mow around the outline of the earthworks. And for the first time in 100 years or more, visitors can see and interact with the ancient cultural landscape. Now visitors can walk around a miles-long trail around the earthworks, and this helps them appreciate the truly monumental scale of this marvel of landscape architecture, designed and built by American Indians nearly 2,000 years ago. And the magnetic data led us to another amazing discovery. We detected a series of disturbances along the inside edge of the Great Circle and selected one very small area to investigate using targeted excavations. And here we found evidence of enormous post pits, more than 3 feet in diameter and almost 4 feet deep. These were where giant wooden posts were once placed and then later removed and backfilled. And 2 radiocarbon samples date the backfilling event to right around the year 100. This new research led us to realize that the Great Circle wasn't just a simple earthen berm. It was underlain by a row of monumental wooden posts, each probably 2 feet in diameter, maybe 20 feet tall, spaced at 20-foot intervals, nearly 3/4 of a mile around. This is the Hopewell Woodhenge. This new research has forever changed the way we think about these sites, the stories we tell about them, and the way we protect and manage them. Before this, our management and interpretation was focused on individual mounds. But now we're talking about and managing and protecting entire landscapes. Where once there was just a big empty field here, now we have evidence that this landscape was once filled with wooden architecture, wooden post circles, community buildings, craft workshops, and ceremonial grounds marked by earthen enclosures and wooden posts. The stories we're telling now are much more active and alive and connected to living people. So this reorientation toward a landscape view has led to changes in the ways we manage natural resources in the park as well. Over the past 4 years, we've converted all the lands that were previously managed under European row crops to native grasslands. This has tremendous benefits in terms of biodiversity, resilience, and sustainability. And it's much closer to the indigenous land management practices that would have characterized these landscapes 2,000 years ago. And our archaeological research has led us to incorporate indigenous land management and indigenous farming practices into our interpretive exhibits. Over the past couple of years, we've installed a native garden at our visitor center featuring tobacco, squash, chenopodium, sunflower, and other plants that American Indians cultivated and domesticated thousands of years ago. And we'd like to collaborate more closely with tribes in this area going forward, bringing traditional ecological knowledge into our present-day management and interpretation. And finally, I'd like to close by pointing to what I see as an opportunity for greater tribal engagement as we transition our park into a World Heritage Site. Our own National Park Service policies already encourage and even mandate consultation with tribes. But when these sites are brought into the global context of World Heritage, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples comes into play as well. Article 11 recognizes the rights and responsibilities of Indigenous peoples to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, such as archaeological and historical sites. And I think this recognition and the principle of free, prior, and informed consent will only strengthen the tribal role in the ongoing management, interpretation, and protection of these remarkable places. So that's a bit of a whirlwind tour of our World Heritage nomination and some recent archaeological research. And I thank you for the opportunity to present here. And now I'd like to turn it back over to Jen Altman.
Thank you so much, Brett. I know that your research and your collaboration with the German Archaeological Institute and with tribal partners is really changing the way that we're seeing these places. And so now it's my pleasure to turn to Brad Lepper, the Curator of Archaeology at Ohio History Connection, who, like Brett, has been instrumental in putting together this nomination, but whose decades-long research is also key to helping us learn about the earthworks. Brad?
Thanks, Jen. Let's see. Yeah, that's in the way. How do I get that out of the way? Let's do this. All right. Well, hello, everyone. This is a presentation. Even 10 years ago, I never would have imagined I'd be able to give. I study, like Brett, the ancient American Indian Hopewell culture, which transformed into something very different more than 1,500 years ago. And the modern descendants of these people now live even more different lives for a variety of reasons, but including a history of diseases, warfare, forced removal, and cultural assimilation, all brought on by the arrival of Europeans. So anyway, I believed there was no one I could go to ask about the purpose and meaning of the remarkable Hopewell artifacts. And after reading the works of American Indian activists, such as Vine Deloria, I had no reason to think anyone from the tribes would want to talk to me anyway. Well, I'm extremely grateful and humbled to have discovered that I was wrong. So this is a rendering of what we think the site earthworks would have looked like around 2,000 years ago. The large mound in the center of the large circle is the site Pricer Mound, and it's one of the largest of the Hopewell burial mounds. It was 73 meters long, that's 240 feet, and 9 meters high, that's 30 feet. The site earthworks are located along Paint Creek, which is a tributary of the Scioto River. This recent photograph on the right gives you a sense of the enormous size of site Pricer Mound. This mound was excavated by the Ohio History Connection between 1925 and 1928. This plan view shows what the archaeologists uncovered at the base of the mound. The small rectangles represent carefully prepared clay basins in which ancient American Indian human remains were cremated. But before the burials were placed there were 3 connected chambers of a huge timber frame structure that were the focus of other ceremonial activities. The arrow is pointing to what was called the burnt offering. This was a shallow pit 9 meters long, that's 30 feet, by 3 meters or 10 feet wide, in which more than 5,000 artifacts were burned and then sealed beneath a layer of clay. The artifacts included ceremonial regalia made from copper, mica, obsidian, quartz, and other stuff brought here from the literal ends of the Hopewell world. There were, however, no human remains in the burnt offering. Given its location, just behind what the archaeologists called the Great Multiple Burial, a clay platform on which the remains of 6 people were laid to rest, it seems likely that the burnt offering represents the decommissioning of the regalia used in some sort of world renewal ceremony linked in some way to the Great Multiple Burial. Among all the amazing artifacts in the burnt offering, Henry Chetrone, who directed the excavation, declared that these 5 engraved steatite spheres were the most interesting artifacts to him. Based on their size and shape, Chetrone and his crew at first facetiously referred to these spheres as marbles. However, that soon became the accepted interpretation. And in the report of their excavations, they declared that the marbles had been buried with a child in burial 13. There are, however, a number of problems with that interpretation. First of all, as Chetrone frankly admitted, there is no record that the game of marbles was ever played among pre-contact American Indians. Second, these spheres weren't buried with the child in burial 13. In this figure, I've plotted the approximate locations of where the 5 stone spheres were found, and that's represented by the red X's. This gives the impression that they were associated with burial 14, not 13. But even that's deceptive because all 5 stone spheres came from the burnt offering, which was separated from the burials by that clay floor that sealed in the contents of the offering. The burials were added later. So based on this review of the evidence, the case for these objects being marbles seems shaky at best. And there's even the suggestion that the location of the finds was deliberately falsified to support the weak but entertaining story of a child being buried with their favorite toys. So what were these curious stone spheres? The first inkling that I had about an interpretation that actually made sense was in 2014, when I attended a consultation meeting with a number of tribes that was hosted by the Eastern Shawnee tribe at their Blue Jacket complex in Oklahoma. The consultation had nothing to do with trying to figure out the purpose of some ancient Hopewell artifacts. That opportunity arose completely by chance. During a break in the meetings, I was given a brief tour of some tribal museums. My guide had stopped at an exhibit of the Shawnee drum when Ben Barnes, then the second chief of the Shawnee tribe, now the chief, happened to be walking past and stopped to join the conversation. Ben was a member of the White Oak Shawnee religious community, and he happened to mention that they used spherical black stones, which they gathered from a very special location, to attach the hide drumhead to their sacred water drum. I said, we have some spherical black stones in our collection from the site Pricer Mound. And we casually discussed whether there might be some connection. Well, that casual discussion turned into months of emails and phone conversations that resulted in a joint paper in Archaeologies, the Journal of the World Archaeological Congress, where we made the argument that these 5 spherical stones were all that was left of the oldest known drum in Eastern North America, the rest of the drum having been consumed in the fires of the burnt offering. For me, this was an amazing opportunity to gain insights into a Hopewell artifact from a descendant of the people who participated, to one extent or another, in the ceremonies that took place at the earthworks I've been studying for my entire career. It's a powerful lesson that even in the face of centuries of turmoil and catastrophe that I can't even begin to imagine, that people can find a way to hang on to precious bits and pieces of their culture. Now, I don't know how to go looking for more of those pieces, but by building relationships of trust, where these kinds of unguarded conversations can take place between archaeologists and descendant communities, you make opportunities for magic to happen. I'll leave last to Chief Barnes. So thank you very much, and back to Jen.
Thank you so much, Brad, and to Chief Barnes too for your really fantastic collaboration. It's a model for how research should happen, and we hope to see more and more of those types of collaborations. And finally, it is my sincere honor to introduce Chief Glenna Wallace of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. As Bert Logan said at the beginning of this webinar, Chief Wallace is a true friend and partner in this work, and her persistence, passion, and vision have changed us immeasurably for the better. She's a member of our World Heritage Ohio Ambassadors Group and has been for many years, and an essential member of our team, and we are grateful for her every day. And now, Chief Glenna Wallace. Okay, Chief Wallace, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay, it's all yours.
I am truly honored and humbled to hear the words of such hardworking people and people who at one point were strangers and now are dear friends, and the progress that we have made. Before I can speak about where we are today, I have to go back and give you some personal information about myself. 2007 was a year that greatly influenced my life and has influenced all of these individuals that we are hearing today. And that was a year that I traveled to Ohio, to the Ohio State University, to hear a lecture given by an author by the name of John Sugden. John Sugden had written a book about Tecumseh, and he was going to give a presentation. Of course, Tecumseh was a Shawnee, and I am a chief of the Eastern Shawnee tribe, and I wanted to hear that presentation, and I wanted to meet John Sugden in person. I had been elected as chief of the Eastern Shawnee just the prior year in 2006. Never in my wildest imagination did I ever think about being a chief of a tribe. I was not brought up in a traditional sense. I was not brought up in an active role in a tribe at all. Later, yes, but in the beginning, no. I was brought up in a family that my father was a lead and zinc miner. He finished the 8th grade of school. My mother finished the 10th grade of school. We lived in rural Ottawa County, the place where today 9 federally recognized tribes reside, the most in any place in the United States. And 7 of those tribes were indeed removed from the Ohio Valley. So we have ties back to Ohio, but they had not been close ties whatsoever. My father and my mother, we were never a rich family except in human relationships. We were close, we had love, but financially we were exceptionally poor. And my father retired from the lead and zinc mines there in Pitcher, Oklahoma, and he placed that retirement funds in purchasing an old farm truck, placed trusses on it, put a tarpaulin over the top, and back in the 1940s, we became some of the first RVers in the United States. It was very much a picture like we see of Granny when we talk about the Beverly Hillbillies taking off and going from Oklahoma to Oregon and then to California. For 2 to 3 years of my life, from the time that I was about 8 or 9 years of age until I was about 11 years of age, I lived the life of a migrant worker. We traveled, we moved frequently. We lived in all types of housing or non-housing entities. We picked every type of product that there might be. We were taught that we had a responsibility to our family, and we had a responsibility to contribute to the upkeep, to the financial welfare of our family. So each day we were given an assignment of what we were to do, and we were told how much work we needed to produce that day, how many quarts or how many pints of strawberries, how many lugs of a certain type of fruit, how many pounds of green beans we were to pick, how many heads of lettuce or cabbage that we were to cut, how many apples we were to pick, and it went from crop to crop, place to place. We were incentivized in that our parents told us that we had a certain obligation to the family, but once we met that obligation, when we exceeded that, then we were able to keep that for ourselves. And that affected my entire life. Being there in Oregon and California, moving constantly, knowing what racism was and experiencing it because we were from Oklahoma, we were migrant workers, and we were Indians. So we weren't at the top of anybody's status symbol, to say the least. My father became ill and we had to come home, and he had to have surgery, and he had tuberculosis of the spine. And I learned very early that my life was going to be their life unless I did something to change that. I recognized that my father was disabled, that we were going to have to be on welfare, and I wanted to be off of that as quickly as possible. I also recognized that my mother had very few options of what to do. She had 5 children. We lived in the country. She didn't have an education. We didn't have transportation. And so she had very few options. And that word became very important to me. I didn't know what I wanted to do in life, but I did want options. And education was the only way that I knew to do that. And so education became important to me. And some way, somehow, I managed to graduate from high school, the first female in my family to have ever done that, to marry, to go on to college, and to finish college and get a teaching job at a community college in Missouri, the state that is right next to our tribe. Life there at my community college affected me because within 5 years, I was promoted from instructor to the department director. And then within just a few years, several departments were combined into a division, and I was named that division head. That division, previously I had just been in communication, but now I was division head of communications and fine arts and design. I knew nothing about fine arts. I had actually lived in pigsties in Oregon, and to be the director of fine arts, I had no experience in art, in music, in theater, in historical places. And yet I was determined that that rural college and our students were going to be exposed to various fine arts. And so we introduced a travel series. And in that travel series, I directed that and was able to provide some scholarships for students as well as support from community members. And in that travel series, I was able to travel to almost 70 countries and to see many World Heritage sites, a word that I had never heard before. And then in 2000, something else happened to influence me, and that was because I live within 2 miles of my tribe, which is located in Oklahoma, but I am on the Missouri side. The chairman of our Missouri Humanities was seeking Native Americans who lived in Missouri because it was going to be the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark, the Corps of Discovery exhibition. And so he was seeking members of tribes who had been noted in the journals of Lewis and Clark. And being Shawnee, living in Missouri, teaching at a college, my name was put forth by the president of my college. I was contacted and said that there was going to be a 4-year celebration of that Corps of Discovery. And we wanted to give programs throughout Missouri and other states reflecting the history of those tribes, the culture of those tribes, etc. And I was asked to present for the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. I told them that was impossible because I didn't know the history of my tribe. We had not maintained our history. We had not been active in that aspect. We had been so concerned with being so poor and simply maintaining a livelihood that our history had been forgotten. Most of our, all of our ceremonials had been left behind, and we had very little knowledge of who we were and what we were. I at first said no, but the chairman simply would not accept that and said, we don't do this until 2003. You have 3 years to research your tribe, and that's what you're going to do. And so that's what I did. While teaching for 3 years, I researched, read everything that I could about my tribe, traveled to Ohio, had all of the experiences I possibly could to learn about the Eastern Shawnee tribe. It was in 2006 that after that experience, I decided that I was as qualified as other people to run for chief. And so I ran for chief and was elected to be the first female chief ever elected to a Shawnee tribe in the history of the Shawnees. So it was in 2007 that, having read a great deal about Tecumseh, the opportunity to visit with an author about him was something I simply could not pass up. So I attended that lecture, and a requirement of that program for the people who gave that lecture was that they should then the next day go to a place that was called the Newark Earthworks. I had never heard of the Newark Earthworks. I had researched and read extensively for 3 years about Ohio, but the only mound that I ever encountered in my reading was Serpent Mound, and even then that was mentioned only occasionally. So I went to the Newark Earthworks the next day simply to continue to be in the presence of John Sugden. I was amazed. I was astonished. I was so proud, but I was also so angry, so hurt, so emotionally spent. Almost any emotion in the world I felt within those 10 or 15 minutes that I was able to view, and notice I say view, the Newark Earthworks, because there was a professional golf course there on top. of the Newark Earthworks. And there was a tournament being held that day. And we were not permitted to step on the Newark Earthworks. We were not permitted to visit with anyone. In fact, they had additional personnel there that day. They had cart drivers driving the people who were in the tournament. And those cart drivers were constantly shouting at us, telling us we were in the way, we needed to get back, we needed to get away, if we wanted to see something, we should come back another day. We were honestly told, this isn't a day for you, get back, you don't belong here. We did manage to walk up to the viewing platforms. And when I walked up to the viewing platforms and looked out upon Newark Earthworks, because of the 20 years that I had traveled to the 70 countries, because of the numerous World Heritage sites that I had seen elsewhere, the pyramids in Egypt, the Great Wall of China, Stonehenge in Great Britain, the Acropolis in Greece, and I could go on and on. Looking at Newark Earthworks, I knew immediately that this was a World Heritage Site equivalent and that it should be recognized. And I was angry that so very few people knew about it. And I was angry that people weren't respecting what it was. I was angry that I was not permitted to even place my hand upon it or walk upon it and spend time meditating with. I don't maintain, and none of us do, that we were responsible for building the mounds, but we were responsible for respecting them. We were responsible for maintaining them. We were responsible for preserving them and doing with them what they originally were built for. And so at that moment, I was disappointed in Ohio. I was disappointed in the very few people who seemed to be interested at all, and no one knew very much about them at all. At the same time, in that year 2007, I was already planning a bus trip to go back to Ohio to take members of my tribe, citizens of my tribe, to a homeland tour of Ohio, because most of our people had never been there, the homeland of our ancestors. And so, knowing that the Ohio History Connection, even though they were not the sponsors of that lecture series, knowing that Ohio History Connection was responsible for maintaining historical sites in Ohio, I contacted Ohio History Connection. The contact at first was not favorable. The contact at first was not encouraged. The contact at first revealed that Ohio History, known at that time as another name, the Ohio History and OHS Society, that they did not really have much contact with federally recognized tribes and really did not do much with federally recognized tribes. I refused to be denied. Maybe I was angry enough that maybe I was even not the most tactful. But anyway, at some point, the then director of Ohio History Society, Bill Laidlaw, agreed that he would let us go to Wappatomica and some other places that were known in Eastern Shawnee history. Unfortunately, I never met Bill Laidlaw in person. He had a massive heart attack before we were able to make that trip. But without his permission, without his agreeing to work with us, none of this would have happened as far as I'm concerned. I maintained, we went to Ohio, and I maintained contact with Ohio History Connection. At a later date, Bert Logan became the chair there, and Bert has been the chair ever since. And Bert has, so many things have changed. He enumerated so many steps, so much progress that has been made. And so at first, I was interested in only the Newark earthwork mounds, but then my interest grew. I was definitely concerned about the number of human remains there in Ohio, and again about the indifference that seemed to be existing there. From those steps and from that contact with Bert Logan, with the Ohio History Connection, he enumerated so many things that have happened. We now have an annual conference. That annual conference has grown from just being with Ohio History Connection. It has grown to include the National Park System. It has grown to include the transportation division there in Ohio. And I'm sure it will continue to grow. It has grown from only 3 or 4 tribes to begin with to now contact with, as they indicated, the 45 tribes. Our interest, we still are interested in our human remains there. We still are interested in getting those buried. We are still interested in finding a cemetery there in Ohio, because our ancestors, they never lived in Oklahoma. And when they need to be reinterred or interred and to meet Mother Earth again, they would want to be there in Ohio, and that's where we prefer to place them. Since that time, I have met many people, and it has evolved into the committee that is established today. And we are pursuing the nomination for World Heritage status. It is not just the one tribe, the one mound now, as they've indicated, it's several mounds that's included in that nomination. This has been going on since 2007. Staff has been hired. We now have Jennifer Altman, who is in charge of that, and she is leading this, and I firmly believe that we are going to be successful in getting that nomination and being a part of World Heritage Sites. And it's been my privilege to work with such wonderful people and for them to carry the water for us, as we oftentimes express. And so, Jen, I'm going to turn it back to you before I actually break down and cry over this moment, to see and to know that I have such dear friendships, and I have such hardworking people, and so many knowledgeable people, far more in areas that I could not possess. And so I am a lucky woman. Jen?
Thank you so much, Chief Wallace. I should have put the tissues nearer by. We can't possibly say how much your words mean to us, and the fact that it took a lot of persistence on your part that it should not have taken, but it did. And we're so grateful that you were persistent and continue to be such a wonderful partner. I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank US ECOMOS for hosting us today and giving us an opportunity to share our work. We're really just at the beginning of this work. And for all the participants, all the viewers today, we'll get to some questions here in a second. I know we're right at 4 o'clock, but if you're willing to hang on with us for just a couple more minutes, we would like to give a chance to address a couple of the questions that we have here in the question box. So I will try to address these to some of our panelists as we go. I think Chief Wallace really addressed one of the questions, which was about the human remains and the involvement of tribal partners in working with the human remains and consultation, that there is consultation ongoing around that. But Chief Wallace, would you like to say anything about the work around getting human remains repatriated back to tribes and reburied, or Brad or Brett, who also work on those issues from the archaeological side? Chief Wallace?
Well, first let me say, as I indicated, that I was not brought up traditionally. And when I became chief, of all of the chiefs around, I was the most unqualified to be able to say, we need to do something. Somebody has to address this human remains issue. But no one was doing it. And it continued to be, no one was doing it. And there continued to be testing and lack of reuniting our ancestors with Mother Earth, until I simply could not be quiet anymore. And so I spoke up and met Brad Lepper. And as Brad says, he's doing things now that 10 years ago he never thought possible. And we are moving forward. And so, and Brett Ruby has been involved in all of this. I will never forget the day that I was there in Ohio and listened to Brett Ruby. And for the first time in my life, he used the words intelligent, brilliant to describe American Indians. And up until that time, the only words that I had ever heard or read were words like savages. So he will always be such a powerful person to me, and he has continued in this. So I'm going to let them speak to that.
Yeah, Brad and Brett, there's also, just to add on to that, there's another question about cultural affiliation and whether there's been cultural affiliation made with any of the Hopewell human remains. So if you'd like to touch on that as well too. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I'll say a few words. And thank you, Chief Wallace, for those kind words. Yeah, these are powerful and deep issues that we've been struggling with for a long time. And one of the things that I've seen, though, is that this World Heritage nomination thing since 2007, 2008, that time frame that I've been involved with it, these discussions have, and this nomination process has really built a new framework for finding common interests with tribes, and it has moved the discussion surrounding human remains forward more in the last few years than it had probably in the 10 years before 2008. That's been my personal experience, that this World Heritage process is making more progress on issues surrounding NAGPRA and human remains, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So that's just a few words from my own experience.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. And Brad, maybe you can take this one. There's sort of an additional piece to that question someone has added, wondering whether the human remains from these sites are contributing factors for the World Heritage nomination, or is it being acknowledged in the nomination that they will be repatriated and reburied?
Yeah, I mean, it's inescapable that these were places where human remains were interred. So to that extent, it's related to the nomination. But the nomination is more about the architecture and the achievements of the people while they were living. And I would agree with Brett that this nomination has moved us forward in having these conversations, these very hard conversations about the human remains and other NAGPRA eligible objects that are part of our collections. And I think all of us in the National Park Service and in the Ohio History Connection are becoming much more sensitized, I think, to these issues and much more knowledgeable about them. And we're building capacity within the Ohio History Connection to deal with these issues. I mean, not just in the future, but now.
Great, thank you, Brad and Brett. There is a question, this one's an easy one I'll take. Someone wants to know who was the author that Chief Wallace had wanted to see in Newark, and that was John Sugden, who wrote the biography of Tecumseh that she came to hear speak. Another question that we have here is about the Octagon Earthworks in Newark, Ohio, and a question regarding the golf course. And so this person asks, if we could please address the golf course situation in Newark. And so I can fill in on that one. As I think Bert Logan alluded to in his video, the Octagon Earthworks at Newark, and Chief Wallace spoke of this, has a golf course, a private golf course located on it. It's been there for over 100 years. And over time, there have been negotiations. They lease the golf course. Ohio History Connection owns that land. There's been an effort to negotiate an end to that lease. And when that did not pan out, Ohio History Connection pursued an eminent domain effort to end the lease early, to buy out the golf course. And so the update on that is that we had 2 lower court decisions in favor of Ohio History Connection's ability to go ahead and buy out the lease. But it's been appealed to the Ohio Supreme Court. And actually the oral arguments in that case will be heard on April 13th. And so if you're really interested, on the Ohio Supreme Court website, they're indicating that oral arguments are still happening virtually, and you should be able to observe those if you'd like to. So that's where we are in that situation right now, still proceeding, trying to buy that lease out and be able to manage the site directly with the Ohio History Connection. Let me skip up here to the Q&A box again. Let's see. One other question here about, there's a professional archaeologist listening who was involved in the development of World Heritage Sites and is wondering, does Ohio plan any efforts to develop National Historic Landmarks or National Register nominations for other Hopewell sites in Ohio? So Brad, I don't know if you're aware of any efforts that might be underway at the moment, but of course these sites are already National Historic Landmarks. Yeah, Brad.
Not really.
Don't know of any, no, none that we're aware of right now beyond those that are part of this nomination. And so let me just check the Q&A box one more time here. I realize we're a few minutes over. Thank you so much, everybody, for sticking with us. And I think we've hit most of the questions here. So I want to thank you again, thank our panelists again for their attention, for their participation, and all the viewers for your attention. And again, to US Ecomos, we really appreciate the opportunity to share our work today. And so I believe we're going back to Doug Comer at US Ecomos for some parting words. Doug?
Here I am. Glad to be back. That was absolutely wonderful. I'd like to thank everybody who is watching for attending this webinar. And I'd like to convey my special thanks to our moderator and speakers. And let's see here, I thought my video was on. I'd like to convey my special thanks to our moderator and speakers, moderator Jennifer Altman, of course, Chief Glenna J. Wallace, Bert Logan, Brad Lepper, and Brett Ruby. It's been my pleasure to meet all of them on site and to experience the emotions attending the return of Native Americans to their homeland. And I hope that all of you might share that experience someday. We have World Heritage Day coming up on April 18, and we have a number of events that we will hold in observance of that. On April 14 at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the US Ecomos emerging professionals will collaborate with Ecomos emerging professionals in Africa to present an intergenerational conversation on society and heritage called Perspectives from Africa and the US. Registration for this is now open at the US Ecomos website. On April 18, World Heritage Day itself, which is a Sunday, a video of the US Ecomos Advisory Council session on monuments associated with oppression, which was chaired by William Bell, who is a member of the US Ecomos Board of Trustees, will be posted on the US Ecomos webpage. And I encourage you to watch that. It was a wonderful session. Other previous webinars will also be posted. Also on that same day, the San Antonio Missions World Heritage Site will host a live chat for her World Heritage Day with participating World Heritage Sites from all around the world. If you haven't been involved with some of these Twitter live chats, they're quite interesting. This will begin at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Now, if you're cognizant of Twitter, you can use the hashtag #ConnectedConservation to contribute to this exchange on Twitter, or you can visit the US Ecomos website for more information about this. Finally, on Thursday, April 22nd at noon Eastern Daylight Time, US Ecomos will hold a webinar on diversifying heritage. A keynote will be presented by Shannon Estenotz, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, who will be speaking on the Biden's administration commitment to DEI. Speakers will include Sarah C. Bronin, Thomas F. Galvin, Chair in Real Property Law and Faculty Director, Center for Energy and Environmental Law at the University of Connecticut Law School, Dr. Autumn Saxton, Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, National Recreation and Parks Association, Ms. Anna Tamara, Historian and Planner, NPS Japanese American World War II Internment Camp Program. We hope to see you at these events. And again, please check the US ECOMOS webpage for more detail. Finally, I ask if you support the efforts that US ECOMOS is making to improve social justice at home, rejoin the international community in friendship, and partner with others around the world to combat the existential threat of climate change, that you visit our webpage to become a member of US ECOMOS. So until we meet again, stay well. We will meet the challenges and embrace the opportunities ahead together. Have a good evening.